Good evening and welcome to Chrononauts, a science fiction literature history podcast. I'm Nate and I'm joined by my co-hosts Jam and Gretchen. And this month we're talking about Galaxy Magazine's international reach. In particular, in this segment, we are discussing the Argentinian magazine Hacia, or Beyond, which was kind of an affiliate of Galaxy, not exactly a direct Spanish translation of Galaxy, but definitely close enough where it justifies a heavy inclusion in this episode. For our previous segments in this episode, we discussed the American magazine International Science Fiction, which was run by Galaxy Publishing House and imported science fiction stories from all over the world to the American market. We also talked about a couple stories from the Italian magazine Galaxia. One of those appeared in International Science Fiction, and one is an original translation, which you can read on our blog spot at chrononautspodcast.blogspot.com. And our last segment that we posted deals with the background of the magazine Hacia, as well as two stories written by Hector Hermann Osterheld, and one of those was co-written by his brother Jorge. So definitely check those out if you're interested in more historical background on what we've been talking about so far. But this segment, we will be focusing on Oscar Varsavsky, aka Abel Esquini, who wrote three stories for the magazine Hacia. So Varsavsky was a pretty interesting figure. He was born in Buenos Aires on January 18th of 1920 to a Jewish immigrant family from Ukraine, though his surname would indicate that the family was at one point from Warsaw, the Polish name for Warsaw being Warszawa. I'm not sure why the English language doesn't make any effort to pronounce cities how they're actually pronounced in their own native language and just kind of makes stuff up. But that's what the English language does, so that's what we have to work with. In 1943, he worked at the Philips Radiotechnical Research Laboratory in Argentina. And at Philips, he worked with a multinational team, including a French engineer, Laverne, an Italian physicist, Levialdi, and an Argentine mathematician, Alberto González Dominguez, and a radiotechnical engineer, Ciancalini. I would imagine that some of these people get directly satirized in tonight's stories. Varsavsky received a doctorate in chemical sciences from the University of Buenos Aires in 1949 and starts teaching there the following year. In 1955, he briefly works at the Institute of Mathematics of the Department of Scientific Research, or DIC, of the University of Cuyo, and in 1956 and 1957 participates in the creation of the University of Bahia Blanca's Institute of Mathematics. He returns to the University of Buenos Aires in 1958, and aside from a brief stint in Venezuela in 1959, he remains at the university until 1966, where he directs a team of researchers formulating the first economic models for Argentina and publishes algebra textbooks for secondary schools. After the 1966 Argentine Revolution, where the president was overthrown by the military starts intervening in the education sector, and there are mass resignations, including Varsavsky, who lives in exile in Venezuela from 1966 to 1968, where he works at the Center for Development Studies, or CENDES, I guess, of the Central University of Venezuela. On his return to Argentina in 1968, he founds the Center for Mathematical Planning, and around this time begins to author his main works on scientific education and policy, which he is chiefly remembered for today. Varsavsky rejected the idea that science happens in a vacuum and that science is inherently linked to politics and culture. In the book Towards a National Science Policy, he published in 1972, he rejects the idea that Argentina becoming a scientifically advanced nation means that it is just emulating what the Americans are doing, but rather argues for a separate, independent way of structuring scientific development. In this book, he makes arguments to, quote, show that contemporary world science is ideological in the same way as the other levels mentioned, that is, technology, production, and education, and in general that each type of society requires its own style of science, different in its content, its priority problems, its research methods, and its practical criteria of truth, as much as in the sociological characteristics of the group of researchers, arguing that, quote, in particular, our universities, in their not very successful following of Northern trends, are incapable of understanding the techno-scientific needs of that social transformation and end up as mere instruments of cultural colonization. He goes on to conclude, quote, today the university teaches a science, a technology, physical and social, a concept of the professional role, and an attitude towards society that are imitations of what is done in the Northern Hemisphere. This cultural followership reinforces our economic dependence and hinders every attempt to reorganize our society on fair foundations and with more human, less reifying criteria. He has a brief period in Peru where he works at the Center for the Study of Popular Participation in Lima from 1972 to 1973 and dies in Buenos Aires in 1976, his health having been failing for quite some time at that point. So while he died around the same time as Osterheld and Rodolfo Walsh and other left-wing figures who were murdered by the regime at the time, his health gave out before he was caught up in all that stuff, despite being forced out of the country from the previous coup in the late 1960s. So in addition to his writings on science education policy, he was extremely prolific in writing mathematics and science publications, having around 50 published works throughout his entire career. His early work on physics, logic, and mathematics, and the bulk of his bibliography is on mathematical economics, simulation, planning, and modeling from the early 1960s onward until his death. It's definitely beyond the scope of the podcast to analyze his technical output and his writings on science education and policy, and we'll link to several books in the description that do just that. But we're, of course, here to look at his fiction output, which is pretty much ignored by most of this secondary sourcing. We mentioned previously that he answered the letters that appeared in Hacia in the letters column, but he also had 3 fiction pieces that appeared between the November 1953 and January 1954 issues of Hacia or Beyond while he was still at the University of Buenos Aires. These stories are clearly heavily based on his time at Phillips. Rather than publishing these under his own name, he used the pseudonym Abel Esquini, or I guess the Spanish pronunciation Abel Esquini, but it sounds to me more like he's trying to do like an Italian name type of thing. So I'm not sure how he would have actually pronounced it using the Italian or the Spanish pronunciation, but that was the name he used. It would appear that these are the only pieces of fiction that he had ever wrote, which I think is too bad, as while these 3 stories are more or less the same story written 3 times, they're all pretty fun and definitely have a certain charm to them. And since they're all more or less the same story, unlike when we did the Arelsky Tales of Mars series of 3 connected stories, I think it makes sense when we do the plot summary that we're just going to run through all 3 as a set in a row. And then I guess before we get into the plot summary, we can discuss how we feel about them in a non-spoiler section, and then afterwards discuss how we feel about all 3 of them as a set. I guess with that said, what do you guys think about Proto-Nickel, Nemobius fasciatus, and the Nyctalopes?
I don't know. It was fun. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't seem like a great place to work, does it? Everybody hates each other.
Yeah, a lot of vindictiveness and pettiness. Yeah, I think they're really fun. As you mentioned, they do follow very similar plot structures, so they all do feel like the same story being told 3 times, but it is still like a really fun read. You can see where the story goes, but it's still a fun little twist at the end. I thought was nice to read.
Yeah, I don't know too much about Phillips in particular and the characters involved there, but certainly at other research laboratories, there was no shortage of huge egos in the mix. I mean, probably the most famous example is William Shockley, who was one of the co-inventors of the transistor, who founded his own company after leaving Bell Labs, and a whole bunch of people who left he referred to as the traitorous 8 who went to found Fairchild.
But he didn't try to kill anybody, did he?
No, but he poured the fame and prestige and money he had into founding eugenics research in the later half of his life, and was apparently a huge notorious asshole, really abrasive personality, and while he didn't try to directly murder anybody, you could see that just pushing it a little bit further, you might be able to get there. So, I mean, this is obviously satirizing some of the egos.
Rock star scientists, basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's funny, I've been listening to a lot of YouTube channels where they talk about that kind of stuff, and the reason why bands break up and stuff that I never really realized, that some of the bands I listen to and the turmoil behind the scenes. And you would think that a bunch of scientists would be a lot more cool and collected, but I don't know. It seems like maybe Varsavsky is speaking from a little bit of experience here, so I don't know.
I guess anyone can be susceptible to office politics, even very extreme ones, like we see in the story.
Yeah, I mean, my day job puts me in contact with a lot of people who have been basically working in those exact same facilities for years and years and have advanced PhDs, and some are like major award winners. And not to name any names or say what I do, but some of them are, let's just say, less down to earth than others, for sure. So it's definitely not a problem that is unique to the 40s and 50s, and I think is very much continuing to this day. Certainly, the trap that some people with PhDs fall into is when you get your PhD, you become basically the world's foremost expert on a particular niche subject
Oh, yeah.
when you write your dissertation. And that gives people the idea sometimes that, well, if they're the expert on this in the world, they're also an expert on like literally everything else. And it can lead to some really, really unbearable ego issues that, yeah, it just makes it difficult dealing with some of those people sometimes.
You should start writing your own stories, man.
Yeah.
Just replace all the names and institutions. Everything will be fine.
Yeah, write it under a pseudonym, you know.
Yeah, right. I guess that's what Varsavsky did. I mean, I don't think he was ever directly mentioned in the pages of the magazine, both in terms of his fiction output or in writing the letters column. And, you know, a lot of that stuff was elaborated on by Abraham's amazing work and some of the other scholars who have looked at this stuff before him. But yeah, Abraham, as we mentioned in the last episode, did an incredibly amount of work digging into this. But yeah, I think if you combine maybe the Varsavsky stories with the bureaucratic existential horror of the Gormenghast series, you might have a pretty good description of what the modern scientific and engineering research and development world looks like, which is, I don't know, maybe less fortunate than it could be.
Yeah.
I do kind of wish he had just told one story and just made it like more tight and awesome, and it's like maybe a little longer, and then just I mean, it's fine the way it is. And I guess in a magazine it's a little different. Like, it's not like he probably didn't imagine that these stories would ever be put into some kind of book back to back or anything like that. So
yeah, I can imagine it works a little better, like having it broken up by the other stories in each issue. You know, it's obviously the way I had read them is I did just sit down and read them all back to back in like one sitting, which when you do that, obviously the similarities really pop out, probably more than they were intended to.
Yeah, and in the magazine form, they're all really, really short. I think the pages in the magazine, they fit like a pretty larger word count than the pages of Galaxy, despite the fact that they're the same physical size. They have like a smaller font, so they fit more words on the page. But these are all like 2 or 3 pages in the magazine, which is like bookended by a bunch of, you know, like 25 to 50 page novellas, novelettes, and other very short stories. So they're definitely among the shortest pieces that fit in the magazine here. So
the way you set up the background and everything, it really made me think of a scientific detective story, right? And I've always been kind of fascinated by the idea of science fiction detective stories, right? Like this idea in the future that we might have something like that, or I don't know. I don't know. I appreciated that aspect. I just, they were over when they practically began, right? So
yeah,
it's fine. I'm glad he told these stories, but I just, like it's sort of the same thing that I sometimes have with, even as a fan of really short stories. There's a couple of these that I would say like, oh, this, you know, just pick something and stick with it and maybe add a little more depth to it or something. It's like I can even pick right now. And I thought about this, and I can't even pick which one I liked more than the others, really. Maybe the third one, just because it's the last one I read. I don't know. Nyctalopes. I keep forgetting that, but that's also the name of a French weird supervillain type novel series, the Nyctalopes.
Nice.
Anyway, I can't even remember exactly if any of them stood out more than the other. I guess by the time I read the third one, I was kind of used to the format, so I knew it was pretty easygoing just because I kind of expected something like this. And there's always, it's a bit of a twist at the end, but it's not really a twist because you know something like this is going to happen, right? So, yeah, I don't know. It was cool, though.
They do kind of blend together when you read them all in a row like this. It does remind me a bit of thinking of when you said, Nate, that this would be bookended by a lot of longer works, a lot more of a variety of works in the magazines. Almost similar to certain magazines that might have like a comic or something in there that would just be like a running gag or a theme that goes through like a different magazine. I will say that even though they all do follow the same structure, it is interesting that all three of them do tackle like a different field of science, or, a little bit of a change in which scientific area of the crimes that we will get to. They all kind of differ in their own ways, which is pretty fun as well.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those research labs were literally working on everything. Again, I'm more familiar with Bell Labs in the 40s and 50s, and they had their fingers in pretty much every emerging technology at the time. And I'm sure Philips was the same way, because they were a Dutch company and they had a foothold in Argentina. It's just kind of crazy in how some of those corporations were able to spiral out in an international way relatively early on. All right, let's take a look at what actually happens in these stories. So, yeah, like I said, I'm just going to run through all three at once, and afterwards we can just talk about them. So the first one up is Proto-Nickel, which is the first of the Crimes of the LIO series that appeared in the November 1953 issue of Beyond, or issue number 6, which opens up with our anti-hero Caldero, the Spanish word for cauldron. And I think it's the only punny last name I didn't note in the text, as it is an actual Spanish last name, unlike the other ones, but Mr. Caldero was fed up with all the pranks the neighborhood youths are playing on him, the Mad Wizard, and he furiously kicks a wallet tied to a string, which normally would be pulled like a fishing line by these youths, but today he almost takes off one of their fingers by kicking it and, I guess, exerting an incredible amount of force on it, where it causes a bit of injury to one of the kids on the other end of the line. He hasn't gotten wise to their pranks, but is incredibly angry at the snub he got at his workplace, the LIO, or the Laboratory of Investigation at Orselec. LIO in Spanish means something like mess or disorder, which prompted a whole bunch of giggles from the locals in Buenos Aires, as it was a foreign acronym coming from New York. And again, I would imagine that something like this probably happened when the Philips organization had something that they named internally from the Netherlands that probably did not translate well into Spanish. But 1 week ago, he had presented his boss, Nogler, with the plans to develop Proto-Nickel, which Nogler scoffs at and hands the project over to El Petiso Trapisondes, who finds several flaws with the plan. This is another one of our punny names, where Petiso means short and Trapisonda is a synonym of like LIO, like mess or disorder, and naturally El Petiso has to die. The idea is that since an atom's nucleus occupies a volume that's billions of times smaller than the volume of the entire atoms, if you are able to scrub the electrons that are rotating around the nucleus off, you could fill all that empty space with other nuclei to create a super dense material, in effect the first successful nuclear polymerization. At home, his housemaid's iron is shorted out, one of the tricks played on him by Sabo, the wallet fisherman from the beginning, which Caldero ignores and goes to his laboratory, where he's already fabricated proto-nickel and will use it to kill Trapisondes. In creating a super dense sphere, he'll only need a little of it to suspend over Trapisondes' head via magnetic coil, and when the power is cut, the sphere will fall, its super density piercing the skull like a bullet, but since it's so small, it will leave no trace, the perfect crime. Not so fast, however. As Sabo continues to play his tricks on Caldero, shorting out his cook's iron again, which caused the power in the apartment to trip, thus causing the proto-nickel sphere to fall through Caldero's skull, killing him without explanation, the doctors ruling the cause of death as a stroke. So yeah, that's the end of proto-nickel, with Caldero accidentally killing himself through an accident, or actually, I guess in a way he killed himself, even though the cause was exerted by Sabo, not an intentional prank. But this brings us to our next story, Nebobius fasciatus, appearing in the next issue from December 1953, where we get a similar setup. Flacco Puntuolini, the punny name of Flacco being skinny and Puntuolini being some kind of Italian construction of punctual, is perpetually late to work, and thus he's being reorganized to work under El Petiso Trapisondes. This won't do, so now he'll also have to kill El Petiso, and in musing it over, arrives at Pavlov's conditioning. So what he does is train a giant dog to respond to an ultrasonic tone, one that the dog can hear but humans can't, to attack a dummy. Poor Fusible the dog is shocked with electrodes to get the training, but eventually he tears up a human-sized object when the tone is produced. Unfortunately for Flacco, the field cricket, scientific name of Nabobius fasciatus, produces the same sound, so when one nearby makes its ultrasonic chirping, Fusible the dog sees the nearest human-shaped object, which just so happens to be Flacco, and tears him limb from limb. And then our last story, Nyctalopes, appears in the next issue from January of 1954, opening up with Nogler posting a cryptic job posting to a local newspaper. And I would say out of all the translation work I've done, this was probably the biggest puzzle I had to work with, and while I had to bend it a little bit to get into English, I'm satisfied with how it worked out. So basically, it's in very cryptic shorthand. The posting is AF Res LEK elect Rec CV to LIO, which he intends to say, Assistant for Research Laboratory, extensive knowledge of electronics required. Send CV to LIO.
Oh, yeah, I bet this was a lot of fun, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just trying to figure out how to do this. Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely was. It's, again, not 100% literal from the original, so if you want to check out how the original is versus my translation, we link to the scan of the original magazine in the Blogspot posting. But yeah, it's fun to have these like interesting linguistic puzzles here.
Yeah.
And if the applicant isn't smart enough to figure it out, well, they don't want them anyway. Instead, they get hundreds of applicants thinking it says, apartment for residential living, enormous kitchen, electric. Send required credit verification to LIO.
Yeah, this was funny, actually.
Yeah. It is a pretty good joke. And I think this one, the third one, has the most jokes in it.
Yeah, for sure. That's probably why I liked it best, right? Because it's more memorable.
Yeah. Applicant number 261 comes in from a certain Cupides with help from Gladys, the LIO secretary. Cupides, living up to his name, is in love with every woman he sees, including Gladys, and during his interview, he's impressively expounding on noctovisor technology while simultaneously fixated on Gladys and sighing frequently in her direction. This thoroughly embarrasses El Petiso Trapisondas, who decides he must kill Cupides. Nogler assigns the two of them to work on the noctovisor technology, but El Petiso wants all the credit for himself. He rigs up an elaborate scheme, which is basically like an elaborate Roadrunner cartoon, where he's going to have the night vision visors make it seem like the road is flat and straight, but in reality, it's a dangerous curve going over a cliff. Unfortunately for him, Cupides has the exact same idea and beats him to the punch, which El Petiso realizes at the last second before his car careens off a cliff. And I do want to comment on the illustrations on this piece, as they're illustrated by a Luis Angel Dominguez, credited just as Dominguez, as opposed to the previous two pieces, which were illustrated by Pedro Olmos, credited as just Olmos, as both Gladys and the scientist are depicted with darker skin and features that clearly show them as not being Americans, unlike most of the other illustrations in the magazine, which, somewhat tying into Varsavsky's anti-colonial themes, he would address later in his nonfiction writing. These are very much depicted as people living in Argentina, not generic Northern Hemisphere European American types that you would see in a lot of the pulp science fiction. So it's interesting to see that cultural element come out in the illustrations for this story, probably more so than any of the other stories that appeared in
That's interesting, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's our three stories where we get basically all the three scientists trying to kill the same person. And only our Cupides is successful.
This one had some futuristic car technology, though. That was cool.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
Made me think of a lot of people have screens on their dashboards now, right? Different idea about how to use stuff. It's not like a computer or anything like that, but I don't know. It was kind of neat. And yeah, I enjoyed the little double meaning joke at the beginning there. Reminds me of something I listened to a while ago where a guy was talking about the band The Shags. And he was like, well, even the name is a mystery, right? And he's like, well, is it a bird? But to an ornithologist, sure. Is it a type of tobacco? Yeah, to a smoker. And to a prog rock fan, it's a remote glimmer of a possibility. Yeah.
Yeah. I also do like the added detail that Cupides does end up filling the ad only because he had a clue from the secretary rather than actually understanding what the ad was.
Yeah, yeah. It's like somebody needs to point out to the egghead that it's not what he thinks it is,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. And then, yeah, you got your applicant, who's actually a really good scientist, and is like the wonder kid, right? And all the office staff are into him, apparently. And he's like making like sighing noises while he's rattling off some formulas. Like, okay, it's okay. I wasn't sure exactly what was happening there, but it was funny. Then, yeah, it's like, what is he doing? He's just looking at them.
Yeah, just flirting with Gladys the entire time while he's doing this interview on night vision technology while talking about capacitors and the latest innovations from the North American research labs at the same time. So quite the ladies' man, it would seem.
Yeah, so naturally his rival, is consumed with jealousy and wants to make sure that he gets all the credit for the invention and stuff like that. Yeah, will the rivalries and murders at the laboratory ever end? Who knows?
Well, that doesn't seem so, because presumably if there'd be a fourth one, there'd be more murders to go around.
Yeah.
It would be cool if he did different crimes in each of the story. I mean, as you were saying, Gretchen, I do like the idea of him focusing on different technologies in each of the story, but if he had just come up with another idea of crimes that these evil bastard scientists could be doing, I think it would have made them stronger as a
Or even have the story take place after the crime and have somebody come in and try to figure out exactly what happened. That might have been fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because I feel like the potential to have more than just murder at this giant laboratory, there's all sorts of, I'm sure, fraud and thefts that you could do as well, but mostly murder. The murders of LIO, I think, perhaps is a bit more apt.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Although I will say, now knowing a little bit more from the background, I think it's really interesting that there is that emphasis on LIO being a joke name because it came from somewhere in New York. The North American offices made this decision and kind of like ties into this idea that, this is a South American country trying to do what North America is doing and taking in that colonial mindset and it just backfiring and making it just another joke in this work.
Yeah, exactly. And his writings on science policy and I guess the anti-colonial themes to come out in his views on what Argentina should be doing as far as science education and national research and development, all that kind of stuff, were way later than these. Like, these were pretty early in his career, written in the early 50s, where he was writing that stuff in like the late 60s, early 70s. But I mean, there's clearly an anti-colonial theme that runs throughout here, even though it's not in the forefront. We, I guess, see the joke from the New York office as well as, I guess, kind of an international cast of characters. So I guess it's kind of hard to say with Argentina, as Argentina has a lot of immigrants from all over the world, really. So
and even just like the names of our characters and the authors, and we see like quite a variety of potential influences. Varsavsky being Ukrainian / Polish, right?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting, too, that a lot of the puns, as you were saying, Nate, you had to add notes about the kind of puns here, because it's very culturally specific to Argentina, to the language being spoken, which is always the case with wordplay. But I think that the fact that he chose to write in this style and have all of those puns, I think also speaks to him wanting to put that Argentine identity into his work.
And I definitely wanted to keep that in the translation and spell it out with notes rather than just translating the words themselves, like the International Science Fiction magazine did with the Luigi Cozzi story. I didn't read that in the original Italian, but you had the last names of like I'm a Believer translated into English, so I don't know if he kept that in English from like the Monkees song or if he like actually wrote it in Italian. But there's a lot of times in other stories where they will translate the puns and things like that. And I think it just makes it like, it kind of strips the cultural identity from the original stories when you do that. So I wanted to keep that in the story as much as possible, even though, I don't know, I sometimes feel like I annotate the stories too much, but I would rather have more annotations than too little annotations, I
Right.
guess, because I really do want to keep the cultural identity of
Yeah.
these stories as much as possible.
Yeah, and it is always good when you get a really good copy of a classic work translated from whatever language, and there's some annotations
Yes.
explaining a lot of things. And sometimes, yeah, maybe some of the notes are unnecessary because you might already have some basic knowledge, right? But you can't really assume that the readers are going to be conversant with a lot of stuff. So the Pavir and Volokonsky translations of Russian classics all have extensive annotations that explain everything from geography to what was going on in the newspapers at certain times and social trends and stuff like that. They take the time to try to explain all that if people want to read those. So I do think that's a nice feature to have in a translated work or even a classic work or something like that. And yeah, these stories maybe from a certain perspective, maybe minor works, but this is the first time anybody's really looked at them like this in this fashion. So it's good. It's good to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess one of the reasons that we're doing this is we want to make this stuff accessible to more people. I mean, there has been a couple analyses of these stories in English, but Rachel Haywood Ferreira doesn't go over these stories, and I think they only get a cursory mention in the fanzine history of Argentine science fiction that was published. The Abraham book is still only in Spanish, so I mean, yeah, the English language material that talks about these stories is pretty scant, and these stories have never been published anywhere in English before, though they did get a minor republication in Spanish when the Spanish magazine New Dimension published in the magazine, but they've never been collected in book form or anything like that. And I think possibly the only stories that you can get outside of the magazines that have been republished elsewhere are the Osterheld stories, which were collected in an anthology of his fiction.
And he seems to be the most well-known as a writer.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, as a fiction writer, I should say.
Yeah.
Out of any of the people that we're talking about, besides the Strugatskys, Osterheld is an important figure in Argentine fantastic literature, right? So, if anything, because of Eternata. But Esquini / Varsavsky is obviously more known for the scientific works, so yeah, again, maybe a well-known name in certain circles, at least his real name. When he was answering the letters, what name did he use?
I think it was just no name used in the letters. I think it was just like how they would do it in Galaxy, where they would publish the letters and they would publish like a response afterwards, like kind of like a snarky.
Yeah, all the magazines did that. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, it's cool that they had their own letters for him because, you know, like I mentioned in the last episode, it allowed fans from not just Argentina but all over Latin America and Spain to now become in contact with one another through this new forum of science fiction. And it really was the first magazine in the Spanish-speaking world to have that broad impact and influence, although there were other magazines that appeared before that were of very limited distribution and reach that didn't have the lasting influence that this had. This was kind of really the one to open up the floodgates, if you will. Certainly a bunch of other magazines followed in its footsteps after the magazine closed down after the 4 years it was operating. But yeah, cool little pieces. Varsavsky's an interesting figure, and certainly his nonfiction work has been analyzed a whole bunch. And again, we'll link to all those sources in the description. But I guess now, are we ready to go on to an author who's not really known for anything?
Sounds good.